everything from now on can. Okay. Um, so we are and are not done with Plato and Aristotle. I want you to kind of keep them in at least the back of your mind. But we're moving on to, I would suggest, a decidedly more modern political philosophy with Machiavelli, and one that at least provisionally many of you probably are more familiar with than you might realize. And what it takes us into, specific to political science and especially international relations, is a school of thought that's sometimes referred to as either realpolitik or realism. And the idea here is, never mind how people should behave, never mind ideals. If you really understand power and you really want to thrive in the world of power politics, you have to be a realist. You have to look at the world not as it should be, but with all of its imperfections, because those imperfections are inevitable to the human condition in all of its institutional forms. Okay? That is really what Machiavelli is telling us. So it is not what a lot of people think, though. So the first thing I'd like to do, and again, I'm assuming because you had an assignment this week in addition to whatever else you have going on in your very busy lives, I am not expecting that anyone's had a chance to read any of Machiavelli yet. Okay, so that's okay. That's fine. Um, and so what I want to do is I want to do two things. One, I want to tell you the chapters that I would like you to focus on if you read nothing else. Okay. In other words, go to these ones, and then if you have time, you can skim around. Okay, so if you go to, sorry, I just hit the wrong thing because today I am stupid, and I apologize. Okay, if you go to the online copy of Machiavelli's Prince, okay, you'll see it's pretty easy to get to. The first thing I'd like you to look at is chapter 9. They're Roman numerals, but chapter 9 is concerning a civil principality. And what I'd like you to look at there is, okay, how does someone come to power in a civil principality? Because the reason I'm focusing on that is for our purposes now, the closest comparison we have between what the kind of government Machiavelli's talking about and what we're talking about here would be a civil principality. That is, it's where it's a principality that's governed not merely by the caprice of the prince, but also the implication is by some notion of law. Okay. So chapter 9, then look at chapters 15 through 19. Okay. If you do those things, that's enough to be going on with for this class. So chapter 9 and chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That sounds like a lot until you look at it and realize most of those chapters are pretty short. I mean, Machiavelli's Prince is really almost more a pamphlet than a book. It's very brief. And for our purposes, that's good because he kind of gets in, says it, and gets out. And that's the kind of writing that I like to read. So did everybody get that? Did everybody make note of the assigned chapters? Chapter 9, chapter 15 through 19. Okay, great. So the next thing is to disabuse you of some of the common assumptions about Machiavelli, many of them, by the way, imposed on us by the dubious discipline of psychology. Now, all of my colleagues in psychology would hate me, but they shouldn't hate me because they should be on hate, because there's psychologically that would be some sort of a neurosis, and we don't want that. In psychology, there purports to be a personality type. You know how in psychology often there are types of personalities, and these can be interesting until you really try to measure them or apply them, then they become problematic. And it's called a Machiavellian personality, and someone who is extremely predisposed in that way is sometimes referred to as high Machiavellian, or because everyone in the social sciences likes jargon, a high Mac, okay? Everybody's kind of paramilitary these days when they want to sound smart. And the idea is that a Machiavellian personality in psychology, right, is kind of a sociopath or psychopath. And that is, it's somebody who really doesn't see the need for empathy or concern for others. And it's sort of do whatever you want to because you'll get away with it. You know, be forceful, be self-involved, be non-reflective, you know, just, you know, get what you want. And if it's somebody else's expense, that's no problem. Okay. The problem with that is it perpetuates the stereotype about Machiavelli as a thinker, that what Machiavelli is really saying is to the prince, you know what, do anything you want because you're the prince and you'll be able to find a way to justify it. That is not what Machiavelli is saying at all. And I really need to emphasize that because everyone always thinks as soon as I say that, the first thing that people think of with Machiavelli, if they think of anything, you know, other than Assassin's Creed, is they think, oh, the end justifies the means. Machiavelli never said that, at least not in anything we have a record of. And that's not what he's saying in The Prince. He is not saying, do anything you want and then just justify it. That's not what he's saying at all, okay? And so we need to get rid of that. And we need to substitute for that a much more useful and interesting idea, which is understand that you may need to do, you may have to do things that you don't want to do and that people would rather you not do, but you must do those for the sake of preserving your power, which is your ability to govern the principality. In other words, it's not a personal exercise in hubris and arrogance and brutality. That's not what he's talking about, okay? It's not about being self-involved. You know, it's not about just doing things, getting away with them, and then to say, haha, I can do that because I'm the prince, okay? But he is saying, if you want to survive in the real world, forget the ideal world. If you want to survive in the real world and be able to guide the principality through all of the challenges that it will inevitably face, then there are going to be things you're going to have to do. Some of those things are unpleasant. Some of them are repellent. But if you don't have the stomach for it, then don't be the prince, because governing requires this strong, you know, sort of intestinal fortitude. You've got to have the guts to make tough, unpopular, brutal decisions sometimes. Not because you want to. It isn't about do whatever you want. The prince cannot do whatever the prince wants to do. Okay? The prince has to preserve power. And he points out a number of ways where a self-involved, you know, prince who's just sort of a frat boy can squander the power required to govern the principality in just sort of covering up for stupidity. And that's not a good idea. But that's the second and most important thing, other than knowing what I'd like you to take a look at in terms of reading, is do not look at this as a recipe for self-indulgence or self-aggrandizing. It's not. That it is not. Because later on, one of the things I'm going to ask you to reflect on is when you think of contemporary leaders, like when you think of, let's say, Barack Obama, I'm trying to think of presidents you'd be familiar with. And certainly that would be Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Probably not very much coherent recognition of George W. Bush for most of you. Is that fair? I'm not being condescending. I'm just saying, you know, I change these guys in and out, and you know, because you know, you figure that covers the last 12 years pretty much. And prior to that, you were probably young enough that you didn't really know or care who was in the White House, other than that there was a name or something that your parents either celebrated or yelled at or something like that. So I'd be able to ask you, by the time we finish this discussion in a couple of weeks, would you consider Barack Obama to have been an effective Machiavellian? Would you consider Donald Trump to be an effective Machiavellian? And what I want you to be able to do is understand exactly what's meant by that. We're not talking about some sociopathic or psychopathic personality characteristic. We're talking about a specific way, in a way of almost sacrificing. You sacrifice your ethics, you could sacrifice your morals, because if you are the prince, right, in whatever, you know, whatever governing system, you cannot afford the luxury of merely being good. You have to be powerful. And sometimes that requires you to do very, very unpleasant things. So does that make sense? Are there questions about that or concerns about that perspective or uncertainties? Has boredom already set in? Should I just let you go? All right. I won't just yet, but I have a sneaking suspicion I'm not going to be able to keep you very long. Okay. One of the things that you'll notice then when you look in the Prince, when you look at chapter 9 on civil principalities, is what Machiavelli's talking about there is, in a way, very similar to our discussion of legitimacy. Okay. And he uses these examples. Okay. He talks about these different principalities, and sometimes he's going to use historical examples that you're not familiar with. Don't worry about it. If you're not, I mean, you can Google them if you really want to. It's really not that important at this level that you understand those things. They're just, he feels justified in illustrating these things, then he feels justified in making the claim, okay? And so what he's talking about is, okay, when you have a civil principality, there are really two sources of your support, that is, of your legitimacy. One of them is the support of the nobles, and the other is the support of the people. Okay, so either you are raised to power because the nobles put you there, whoever the nobles may be, right? They may be an actual nobility or aristocracy. It may be it's a ruling political class in a more modern system, whatever it is. In other words, there's either this sort of elite support that you have, or there's a kind of mass popular support. Okay. In modern terms, the mass popular support we often refer to as populism. You'll hear people make reference to different leaders and say, oh, he, she is a populist, okay? Or, oh, that appeal is populism. Or they'll talk about, economic populism. Bernie Sanders is an economic populist, okay? Oddly enough, in some ways, if we could believe what he actually said, so too is Donald Trump. It's just that we don't know what Donald Trump really is because he's not as informed by a fixed set of economic or political principles. He's more improvisational and transactional. But Bernie Sanders is an economic populist in the sense that he is propagating economic policies that are disproportionately to the advantage of the many rather than the elite few. That obviously, he would support, an almost punitive tax system for the very, very wealthy by their standards, right? A lot of economic redistribution, kind of bringing people out of poverty and elevating the middle class to comfortable affluence and things like this by using taxation and redistribution and regulation, right? So he'd be an activist with respect to government, and he'd be a populist with respect to economics. There's also a right-wing populism. Right-wing populism that is a conservative populism, and it might offer some kind of some economic redistribution of some kind, but it's primarily right-wing populism is usually more leveraged on a kind of cult of personality. You get a charismatic individual who becomes widely popular. Why do you support, this particular individual? Well, I just like them. I like what they stand for. What do they stand for? Well, I like what they stand for. Kind of non-reflective. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's, for want of a better term, that's often referred to as charismatic leadership. Okay, that is one trope of usually right-wing populism.
You think Reagan would be like an example of that?
Reagan had elements of that kind of cult of personality about him. He also, though, had pretty solid economic conservative and culturally conservative principles surrounding that.
Right.
He was very consistent with respect to his cultural and economic principles, right? But he had that element of being a kind of charismatic leader, and that was, remember, the expression for him used to be the great communicator. They would talk about Reagan as the great communicator. And the idea behind that was, notwithstanding his obvious elite status economically and even before becoming president, he had a way of externalizing that was easy to understand, that was kind of avuncular, kind of like, gee, that's my uncle or that's my dad or whatever. I can get along with that. You kind of wanted to agree with him, even when he was
Right.
saying things that really, really violated your principles. Be like, well, he seems like a decent man, or he seems like, you know, he could present that almost magically, that very warm, very human. I don't want to say facade because it wasn't a total affectation, but remember that he had had decades of experience as a relatively skillful actor. I mean, you hear a lot of people making fun of that, but he was quite a good actor in his day. Donald Trump clearly is a charismatic leader. But Donald Trump also shows the risk of ruling as a charismatic leader when you don't have a political compass of any kind. That is, he has no political instincts. And when you hear people say, well, but he has these great political instincts, no, he doesn't. And you know he doesn't, because if he did, he would be able to exploit that kind of personal appeal, or sort of, people will talk about magnetism or whatever, that he projects to more than, 38% of the population. He has never been able to do that. If you took away the legitimizing institution of the Republican Party, okay, it's hard to imagine that he'd have much of any support. And when he does too, he makes these appeals that are classic right-wing populism. There's a theory of what's called nativism, and what nativism is it's sometimes called jingoism. It's propagated on a sense of superiority of a certain group of people within a nation state, and a corresponding fear of outsiders. So you're constantly demonizing foreigners, outsiders, all that, while simultaneously glorifying the natural born American, or at least some of them, the ones that suit your image, whatever that might be. That would be nativism. And that's been alive and well in the United States since the creation of the Republic. Donald Trump certainly didn't create that. We've always had about that percentage of the population that is the sort of white nationalist, right-wing, nativist sort of cohort. I mean, every country has that. Britain really has it too. They have a lot of that. But we're seeing the rise of that, by the way, all throughout Europe. The Scandinavian countries have these really strong, resilient, culturally and politically right-wing movements that are actually fascist and neo-fascist, which means they just dress better, really. But yeah, Donald Trump certainly has, as a core element of his, what capacity he has to govern, this notion of kind of charisma, And you'll hear a lot of Trump supporters, and they'll be asked, well, who are you going to vote for? Well, I'm going to go vote for Donald Trump. Okay, well, what is it that he's done he's done a lot of good things. Well, what has he done? Well, he built the wall. Well, no, not really. Well, yes, he did. Well, I don't care, because he said he would. In other words, it's not about really thinking it through and thinking, okay, you came into office saying you were going to do these things. I agree with those things. You did them. Therefore, I will continue to support you. As opposed to, you came into office, you said you would do these things. I agreed with those things, and then you immediately abandoned them. Okay. Therefore, I will not support you. That's someone who hasn't got that charismatic, personalized leadership. But with respect to Machiavelli, this, again, may surprise you. He's asking the question in chapter 9. This is what I really want you to get out of chapter 9. Right? Which one's better? To have the support of the nobility or to have the support of the people? Okay. What would you think would be better? First of all, what do you think would be a more reliable base of power? Who's going to be more
kind of
politically
depend on the
knowledgeable?
circumstances.
Well, it would. Okay, that's right. Oh, and you're right. So let's walk through it. First of all, it's going to depend on the level of political knowledge and attentiveness, right? Because it's pretty easy to govern people who are inattentive, because they just do what they're told. Who's more likely to be politically attentive, the nobility or the undifferentiated mass, such as it exists? Who's going to be more paying attention? The nobility. The elite. Yeah. They're always going to be more politically active, more politically aware than will be the sort of common rank and file citizen, okay? Who's more likely to contest with the prince for power? The mass or the nobility?
The nobility.
The nobility. So see, you kind of have this dilemma. On the one hand, you have to be careful about this. The nobility are politically savvy. That's right. That can be a problem. because they also see themselves as your equal, and they want what you have. And for this reason, Machiavelli actually says, despite what a lot of people think about Machiavelli, the more reliable source of power for you, if you can maintain it, is the people. Because they don't want to govern. They know they can't. But they want not to be oppressed. And as long as you don't oppress them, right? If you don't ask them to do unfair things and you don't take away their property and you don't, I mean, considering this is old stuff, right? Like he actually says at one point, don't take away their property and don't mess with their women, because that was common at that time, and for more than you might think. Now, remember that this is essentially the early 16th century. So we're going back centuries, okay? And at that time, the idea was that if you were a peasant, right, you didn't have much. You had a little plot of land, think feudalism, right? You had a little plot of land. It was yours, essentially. It was yours to work. In exchange for not being harassed, you would give a little bit of what you grew in some sort of tribute or taxation to the prince, right? Somebody would be sent around to gather, like you owe me X number of eggs, or give me a cow, or whatever you got, right? But part of that was because life was so precarious, and because this idea of having children was your only social security, right? In other words, what happens when you're a farmer and you're too old to farm? Well, there was no welfare system at all. So if you wanted to be taken care of, if you lived long enough to live to that age when you really couldn't farm anymore, you had to have big families. Well, the last thing then that you wanted was somebody to come along and take apart your family. Okay. And so if you avoid doing that, Machiavelli argues, people will support you. They'll support you. But the nobility want to oppress. In other words, they want to rule. They want to, put their foot on the neck of the peasantry if they feel like it. Okay. So you as prince have to think about that. I have to keep the nobility from usurping my authority and thus oppressing the people and destabilizing my regime. I have to figure out ways to control that nobility, but there are fewer of them. Okay. And that can be an advantage. You'll see this when you get into it. So in other words, how do you deal with the nobility? If they're the bigger threat, and Owen says they are, and we have to trust Owen today, unless Sarah says otherwise, okay? So how do you do it? You got to understand the nature of your nobility. Some people in the nobility will agree with you. Great, you can rely on their support. Because if they're of the same standing as you, and they agree with you, they'll support you. Okay, they won't plot and intrigue against you. They can't be bought off. They can't, necessarily be frightened. But what if they're cowards? If they're cowards, you can use that to your advantage by terrifying them so that they're afraid to oppose you. Okay? But if they're not cowards and they don't agree with you, then what do you do? Think about Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is a great example of sort of Machiavelli gone wrong.
Ruin their reputation or kill them?
Exactly. You either undermine them, and again, not with the people. You undermine them within the nobility, or you kill them. You get rid of them. You know why? Because they'll kill you if you don't. Because they want constantly what you have. That's why I say, if you want to make sense of Game of Thrones, check out Machiavelli and then watch it again, if you really must, And that's exactly right, Jason, is that those are two ways that you can kind of fend off the offensive of the nobility. Is you either diminish or humiliate them or threaten to do so, right, in front of the rest of the nobility, or you just kill them. You just get rid of them, because you've also established an example. And you see how much easier that is than going out and killing, 150 of the people. You kill one noble, the people don't care. Because remember, they support you. They think you're fab. You look great in a uniform, and they think they like that thing you do with your hair and everything. I mean, they're down. That's all they see. They only see you from a great distance. And so all you have to worry about with the people is to appear to be what they want to see. You don't have to be that, but you have to appear to be that. And as you'll see elsewhere, he talks about the importance of being able to deceive, how important deception is. Okay. But again, it's not just deceive because you can, it's deceive because you must. The people could never possibly understand how complex real leadership is. You don't want them to see what you have to do. And you know what? They really don't want to see it. As long as you don't oppress them, and when the time comes and the barbarians are at the gate, you help them protect themselves. You give them refuge in the keep. You take care of them in a famine, whatever. There's a social contract there, right? As long as you hew to that, you can do a lot of other things and get away with it. You can't do anything, but you can do a lot of other things. But you must not oppress them. You must not. You can punish them. Sometimes you have to make an example. You have to have law, and you have to enforce it. But Machiavelli talks about how to do that. You never do it capriciously. You never just do it because you feel like it, and you never do it because you're angry. Never. One of the things I'd really like you to notice here is how dispassionate this kind of leadership is. In other words, your ego is not involved here. You're not doing this because you're governed by emotion. You're doing it because you're not. What you're governed by is reason and the notion of reality. Okay, so these are really important things to think about. And I think if you can, as you're going through Machiavelli, if you remember those things, right, what does it take to maintain the support of the people? Why is that more desirable than having the nobility with you? A, because you can't, and then how often even the most sort of unsavory decisions you have to make and actions you have to take are done dispassionately. You are never governed by your passion. Always in the front of your mind is, what must I do to protect the principality? Well, first thing is, I have to protect my power. I'm prince for a reason, because I know how to govern the principality, and I have what it takes. If I am taken out of power, the principality could collapse, because the nobility is fractured, and some of them support me, but they're gutless, and they'll just be pushed around like they're on rollers. And then there's these really disreputable people in the nobility who have always resented me because I look better in a hat than they do, and I'm always going to have to deal with that nonsense, right? I mean, he does kind of spell it out for you. He's trying to help you. Another thing that a lot of people aren't aware of with Machiavelli's Prince, this is speculation, but it is something to keep in mind. There is a growing, but still, I would say, marginal scholarship on Machiavelli that would suggest that when he wrote The Prince, it's actually a really subtle satire. Okay, that he's actually making fun, like he's clearly having a go at the church. And he was punished for that. Keep in mind, too, when you read Machiavelli writing this, you're reading someone who once was in a position of significant political power within the city-state of Florence. A new leadership came in, and he was tortured and exiled. I mean, brutally tortured and exiled. He wrote this in exile. So a lot of people look at that and they think, why would somebody like that, who had been the victim of a brutal, inhumane regime, sound like he was advocating or justifying that? So some people say he wasn't. He was having a go at it in a way that, a little bit later on, Jonathan Swift would have a go at leadership with some of the things he wrote. Okay. It doesn't matter whether or not that's true for our purposes. We can take what he's written as written because for hundreds of years, leaders have done. Okay, so never mind whether or not he meant it, we've made it so. So it is an interesting sidebar, though, that I kind of understand it well enough. Thank you, graduate school. I kind of understand the argument well enough to think, yeah, I could see where he's having a go at this. On the other hand, what if he's not? And does it really matter? I remember being in a graduate seminar, and not arguing with the professor, but just asking quite simply, why do we care? Other than that, it's a kind of an interesting cul-de-sac of research or something for somebody who wants to get tenure. Does it really matter if overwhelmingly he's been taken seriously since then? And he didn't have a real response to that. So the hell with him. What does he know? Besides, he's not alive and I am. So I win. All right. Any questions so far?
So when you're asking, like, is this leader an effective Machiavellian? You're sort of asking, are they ruling and making decisions without ego and out of like their rational component?
That would be part of it.
Yeah.
And then with what result? Do they really how well do they follow Machiavelli? And as a consequence of that, again, because nobody does it perfectly and every leader is flawed and every leader makes mistakes. But on balance, would you say that's a fairly effective application of at least some of the principles of Machiavelli, as opposed to that's not Machiavelli at all? Or, yeah, that person tried to be a Machiavellian and turned out to be a bozo. You know, because there are a lot of ways to try to employ this model and end up, I mean, you could argue that Hitler had a lot of this in him. I think I would dispute that, but I know people who have analyzed both Mussolini and Hitler and also Stalin, right, as Machiavellian leaders. The closest to those probably, I would argue now, would be Stalin.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I would say up until about the last 6 or 7 years, maybe or more, I think a close second would be Putin. You know, it's possible, but we'll get into that, and I'll leave it to you to figure out, well, why would that be? Why, you know? And again, we're not saying, was this a good person? We're not interested in that. Either is Machiavelli. Machiavelli's not interested in whether or not you're a good person. In fact, he's telling you, you really can't afford that luxury anymore. You might do that as a common citizen. You're the prince now. You got to be badass now. You got to do.
It's kind of saying that, like, being a good person and being an effective leader are two separate things.
They must be, because that's the world. Exactly. You can say, he says in many ways, it would be wonderful if you could be virtuous, and that's a great thing to be virtuous. Try doing it as prince, though. You will fail. You will fail. Exactly. Good call. So that's the main thing that I wanted you to think about. Now, before we go into that anymore, let's just stop with that idea. The idea in the sense that you can be a nice person or you can be an effective leader. Do you agree with that? Or do you think that's too harsh? You can be both. What do you think? I feel like I'm talking too much.
I think I agree.
Well, wait a minute. No, I agree doesn't help. Either yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. Come on, help me out. I can't deal with no, I agree. So, Jose, are you saying yes, that I can't tell exactly what you're agreeing to or disagreeing with? Are you saying, yeah, you know, you're either going to be a good person or you're going to be a good ruler, but you can't be both? Would you agree with that? Okay. All right. So Jose says, yeah, he agrees with that. Why? Why do you think that is?
I was in when I was in high school, I was in this organization called FBLA, right? And I was voted like the president of the organization.
Oh, that's Future Business Leaders of America, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that was around when I was in high school. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I had like this whole group of people that like I had a lead and I was in charge of making sure they do their specific jobs, right?
Yeah.
But something I found out as I went through was if you're too nice to them, they're just going to walk all over you and they're not going to take you seriously, which was like a very common problem because, you know, you're trying to cater to like, you know, other people say they have their own schedules going on. They got this and that. And you're just like, okay, sure, whatever, it's fine. Trying to be a good person. And then later they just keep making up those excuses and they're not working with you to get anything done.
Yeah, I think Machiavelli would have agreed with you had FBLA been around when he was in high school. You know, be like, yeah, you know, you have to be a badass here. You can't be nice to these people. Don't cut them any slack. Tell them when the meeting's going to be and that you expect them to show up. You know, and again, that might not be very pleasant, but I think what Jose is saying, hey man, if you're going to lead, you got to lead. You know, you got to make a decision, and people have to understand your decision is informed by your skill and ability. Again, this gets back to that question we talked about in the first 2 weeks of legitimate authority. Can you embody that sense of legitimate authority such that the people who you need to respond to you actually see you as a sufficiently legitimate authority that they'll say, okay, you know what? I'm going to have to change my schedule because Jose says this is when the meeting is. I got to be there. That's leadership. And that's someone responding to that because they see you as a legitimate leader. Yeah, you know what you're doing. And they'll see you doing that right up to the point where, for example, you put the meeting together, you get everybody there, and then you single out one of those people in the group and you make him feel like an animal or something, or you make him feel like a bug that you could squash. They might not like that. And they might not see you then as quite so legitimate. Okay. So another thing that you're going to face with this is not only, as a couple of you suggested, is it, according to Machiavelli, all but impossible to be a very virtuous person and be an effective ruler. But he actually poses an interesting question in the midst of that. Okay, and again, we'll get there, and you'll see it as you read those chapters. Is it better if you were a ruler for people to love you, that is, feel devoted to you, and they admire you, and they respect you, kind of that cult of personality thing? Is it better that you have that or that they fear you? Which is better? Now, without having read Machiavelli, just instinctively, don't try to outguess, just think instinctively. First of all, just you as a person, which would you rather have? Would you rather have people love you or fear you?
I would say love.
And what would be the advantage of that?
I don't know. They feel more devoted to you, kind of.
And what does that mean? I'm not at all questioning you. We're trying to walk through and air out the principle here, but you're making a good point. When you say people feel more devoted to you, that's sort of like saying they love you. The evidence is their devotion. But what does that mean in terms of, what does it bring you? How is that an advantage for you?
I mean, it's more legitimate authority if they love you rather than fear you.
Well, but wait, we're just talking about you personally. I mean, I don't like the idea that I have legitimate authority over my friends, all four of them, right?
Right.
And I know what you mean. Yes, you're right. There is a certain legitimate authority, William, that can be. Is it William or Bill, by the way?
William, whenever you want to call me.
Okay, yeah, okay, cool. Well, I'm just going to call you William, as distinct from me. You're right. I mean, in a ruling sense, yes, it can be a source. It can be a source of legitimate authority, just as the support of the nobles can be a source of legitimate authority. Okay. But just you as a person, not yet as a ruler. You haven't been made prince or whatever yet. You haven't been made, Darth Vader yet. Would you rather have people love you or fear you?
I'd probably have to say love too.
Okay. Let me modify the environment slightly. You're just passing the gate into San Quentin prison. Now what would you want? And you're going to be there for 12 years. Now,
prison rules are a little bit different than modern society, I think. I mean, it is cutthroat in certain regards, but fear is definitely a much more powerful tool in prison.
I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah. All of a sudden, you're thinking, especially if you're kind of a scale model human like me, you're thinking, please fear me. In fact, you know what? I don't want you to love me. I just want you to fear me. Okay? I don't want to be your friend. I don't want anything from you. I don't have any cigarettes. Just, either leave me alone or I'll kill you 5 times. That's great. Okay. In other words, when you look at me, see Danny Trejo. Okay. If that's what you've got, you will fear me, despite the fact that Danny Trejo is a little guy, but he was a scary guy when he was in the joint. Right. He was terrifying for a little man. Interesting sidebar on that. I knew really well a guy who did on and off about 7 years of time with Danny Trejo. He was really a badass. He was a dangerous guy. That's not just movie stuff. That's authentic. So what my point in doing that is saying, Machiavelli is really kind of saying that, yeah, you as a person, of course you want people to love you and you want to just have amiable relationships with everybody else. But when you're in prison, I think it was William suggested, the rules are a little bit different in the joint. Yeah, they are. Guess where else the rules are a little bit different? When you're in power. Because then you're in that cutthroat environment that we normally associate with prison. And Sarah just asked an interesting question. Does that take us back to power versus force? I want you to decide that, and I'm not bailing on the question, because here's the thing. Machiavelli throughout this is describing things that might sound like force, but when you see how he relates to the common people, that sounds more like power. He's really trying to encourage you not to use force against the people. Okay, so it's a great question, and it's one of those things that I think it's to a certain extent open to interpretation, but I would say on balance, he would say you're going to have to use force against the nobility in the same way that you're going to have to use force against enemies in other territories. You may not be able to persuade them. You may have to force them to do things. You may have to threaten to kill them. You may have to kill them. For example, if you conquer a territory, one of the things he advises, you can't rely on those people, kill them. Not the common people, the leadership. Because remember, they had, until you conquered them, they had what you now have that you've taken away from them. A lot of them are going to want that back. And so he says, you either get them out of there or it's kind of like what Jason was saying. You get them out of there or you kill them. One or the other. You either ruin their reputation or you remove them in some way, or you kill them and remove them that way. But you don't do that with the people. So, I think that was Sarah who asked that question. That's a fundamental dilemma of Machiavellian power. When do you rely on power? When do you have to use force? Because one of the things that we can talk about a little more coherently now that we've had some time to think about it, that power force thing isn't a simple on-off switch. You either have or don't have legitimate authority. It's a sliding scale, and it is exactly what Sarah just suggested. When you can't persuade, then you have to force. That's the kind of thinking that I like, because you're taking concepts that we had in the first couple of weeks and applying them to later readings. I think that works really well with Machiavelli. You persuade right up to the point where you no longer can, then and only then do you drop the hammer and use force. I think on balance, by way of introduction, that's probably a really good way to think about what Machiavelli is trying to teach us here, is you don't just use force, but when you can no longer persuade and yet you must get compliance one way or another, then and only then do you find ways to use force. Then and only then might you, for example, punish some among the common people. If people break the law, okay, you must punish them. If you do that in a way that is reluctant but necessary, rather than just cavalier and capricious, the people will respect that. Okay, they will then continue to respect you. They will fear you in the sense that they understand that you're the boss and you have a certain control over the enforcement of law that they don't have. But they're more likely to be on board with that if you do it in such a way that they can understand. You didn't just come in and just round up some people at random and cut their right hand off to try and make a point. This person was a thief. Okay, we must punish you. Only you. Having done that, by demonstration, it will be easier for us now to persuade other people. And the fact that the people see us do that in a very deliberate, methodical, and more or less reluctant way. I don't want to do this, but we must enforce the law. Then they're more likely to respect that. And next time you can simply persuade them. You won't have to use that force. But if you use it capriciously, that is just because you feel like it, right? You're going to exhaust the goodwill of the people. Okay. And we'll, again, another thing that we'll get to, but it's kind of pointless for me to go too far into this until you've had the opportunity to read it and maybe check out the video. The video, actually, I really tried to use the video to outline the basic principles of Machiavelli. It's kind of hard to take something this complex and boil it down to essentials, but insofar as I'm able to, that video is probably as good a shot at it as I've got so far. So what I need you to do now is, first of all, are there any other questions in terms of the overview of Machiavelli? You know what chapters I want you to read. I'd like you to certainly have chapter 9 read by Wednesday, maybe have 15 or 16 looked at by then. Just look at, so we can talk about them. The questions I want you to think about are this notion of whether it's better to be feared and loved and why, and the importance of deception. Okay, anything else? Because other than that, there's really no point in keeping you any longer. I think this is a good introduction to little Nicky Machiavelli, and then we can go into more depth. We have plenty of time to do it. I also feel like I'm trying to give you a little time to kind of mentally recover, from our last bunch of discussions and the fact that you just had an assignment. Sometimes it takes a while for the brain to retool, But be ready on Wednesday to do more of the talking and let me do more of the listening. Okay? All right, then I will see you. If there are no other questions, I'll see you on Wednesday.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Do you want us to do all the mentioned reading before next class?
No, as I say, take a look at chapter 9, maybe
Okay.
take a look at 15 or 16, and beyond that, don't worry about it.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, then I'll see you on Wednesday.